That's a clean burning hell, I tell you what.
Radio Free Intimate episode 236, going back to black metal this time, inspired by a funny picture I saw on the internet. So some of you out there might be familiar with this band Necromantia from Greece. You might be into their first album a whole lot, Crossing the Fiery Path. Pretty classic album cover, but the picture that I saw on the internet that made me pointed out something that I'm surprised I never noticed on my own before. Doesn't that Dracula guy on the cover look a whole lot like Rich Piana?
Good fucking morning!
And so with that in mind, I sat down to create sort of a Rich Piana Necromantia parody, and I go to the fourth Necromantia album, third full-length, fourth album overall if you include the Ancient Pride EP, and that's why it's called 4:Malice. And I think I did a pretty good job on it. You know, I changed a demon face to Rich Piano with a pentagram on his forehead. On his hands, instead of saying malice, it says gains. Instead of saying 4, it says 5%, you know, like 5% nutrition. And then instead of saying malice, it says busted.
Oh, busted!
You know, classic Rich Piana catchphrase. And then it's saying Necromantia, it says Rich Piania.
Come on, guys.
I mean, look, it was late at night. I was tired. I couldn't come up with a better one than that. Didn't think of Pianomantia until the next morning. By then, the damage has already been done. But it did get me thinking about the fourth Necromantia album, Malice, which is not really one of the more talked about albums within the Necromantia discography. Is it worth spending your money on? Well, that's a tricky proposition, looking at it from a macroscopic level, because here we have a case of an album coming out right at the tail end of a band's classic era. So it could end up being, you know, like the fifth Unleashed album that nobody really likes that much. There's nothing terribly wrong with it, it just seems kind of tired compared to their classic years. Or it could be like the third albums from Atrocity or Morgoth, which were total sellout trash.
But it could be dynamite!
Like Morbid Angel's Formula's Fatal to the Flesh, which is honestly maybe my favorite album from that band. So which is it?
Let's find out.
But first,
some of you probably need some background on who the heck Necromantia is. Well, they're one of the oldest Greek black metal bands. In fact, the vocalist Magus Vampire Deloth also did quite a bit of production work and is credited, along with Anthony Delaportas, for being one of the sonic visionaries that really cemented the peculiar aesthetics of early 90s Greek black metal. You know, the Hellenic stuff with all the melodies and whatnot.
What is your profession?
And yet, musically, they're not really that close to your Rotting Christs or your Varathrons. I mean, they're still probably closer to that than they are to, like, Norwegian black metal or whatever. But as far as the old school Greek stuff goes, these guys were made more self-consciously evil. And this inversion of all that is good and holy extended even to their instrumentation, because for most of this band's existence, they were a two-piece project with Magus Vampire Deloth on bass and vocals, and then Baron Blood on 8-string bass. The only time they ever used regular guitars was for guitar solos over top all these different layers of bass guitar. The only other band I can think of that had a similar approach to black metal was Barathrum from Finland, who were active around the same time and who I should probably cover at some point. But far from being a gimmick, this bass-led approach is honestly perfect for their sound, which is thick, sonorous, bombastic, and kind of pompous. Whole lot of classical music influence. I mean, they're directly quoting from Gustav Holst here on the first track on their first album. See, there we go. Big, bombastic military march. Timpanis doubling up on those bass hits. You can see what I mean when using nothing but a bass guitar actually really works for what they're trying to do with this sound. The instrument that you are hearing right now playing what would normally be a guitar part is actually Baron Blood with an 8-string bass. And it basically does the guitar job really well because it's got a lot of fuzzy distortion to it. It kind of sounds like a more ancient, primeval form of a guitar because you can really hear the individual strings being picked out. Magus Vampire Deloth's vocal cadence is less verses and choruses and more just semi-military proclamations. when the music speeds up, you can really appreciate that really odd guitar tone, or bass tone rather, and how it interacts with the regular bass playing. This faster section, somewhat reminiscent of a much darker and more modern black metal take on Merciful Fate, is going to take us into another Necromantia trademark. That being their interludes utilizing unorthodox black metal instrumentation. And here's where we run into a bit of a flaw with this, their first album, because a lot of these parts go on way too long, so let's fast forward a bit. Alright, let's see here, come on, somewhere around here. Okay, so after like 3 minutes of the same two flute samples, now we are in for another 5 minutes of spooky chanting and drumming, so let's skip through this. Yeah, that shit does sound kind of funny, sped up 1000%. Okay, here we go. Ooh, spooky! How long is this bitch gonna be screaming for, dude? Come on. Okay, there we go, finally. The black metal came back. And listen, I guess if you're in the mood for it, those really long interludes do well for setting an atmosphere. You know, they're interesting. The first song on their first album is like 14 minutes long, and it's not like a 14-minute long Burzum song. This song didn't really need to be that long. And then the song right after that is just... 5-minute long instrumental interlude.
너는 산이야 바다야?
Yeah, no, it's not a bad interlude or anything, but
Jeez, dude.
I just had to listen to like ladies scream and yell and like weird drumming and flutes and saxophones for like 6 minutes. And then I get 30 seconds of black metal, then I got another 5 minutes of not black metal, but before we finally get some... type shit going on. And then that song's shorter than the interlude one was. And right after it, there's another instrumental intro that goes on for like another minute. Now look, I'm not saying this is a bad album. It's a classic black metal album, and there's a lot of good stuff on that first Necromantia album. It's just, they hadn't quite figured out the signal to noise ratio yet. A problem which they would solve with their second, and in my opinion, best album, Scarlet Evil Witching Black, which is much more concise in its presentation, and also starts incorporating a lot more old school heavy metal melodicism. No, I'm not saying they go full on.
What is your profession?
Like Rotting Christ, Early Septic Flesh, or Verathron. But a lot of this album isn't that far removed from an evil black metal take on something like Kirith Ungol or Manila Road. The bass guitar thickness and sort of biting attack has been considerably beefed up for this release, as opposed to the foggier, more occult tone of the debut album, which really works well when they do stuff like this. Big, epic, heroic, heavy metal riffs, now in a black metal context. That's what I really love about the second Necromantia album. Their third release, Ancient Pride, is also an interesting reinterpretation of their sound because they bring back a lot of those non-metal elements, but as opposed to having them sectioned off into interludes, they're actually fully integrated into the music. This one actually reminds me a lot of the third Verathron release, which was also an EP, because both of them are by far their most consonantly melodic and progressive sounding material they had recorded to date, a pretty substantial departure from their earlier stuff, and yet really, really good. This EP frequently dips into dungeon synth and neo-folk territory, and going along with that sonic shift, lyrical content, while still, you know, there's evil stuff in there, but it's not as consciously occult or dark. There's way more about mythology and history, a little bit of nationalism, which actually had a decent amount of people whining back in the day if you go read old reviews of this. And so now we are finally at For Malice, the album I wanted to talk about. This one's even more of a weird outlier in Necromantia's discography before you even listen to the album. Because something I've definitely brought up on other shows was how the cover of the first Necromantia album is awesome.
Whatever it takes.
But then when it got reissued in the early 2000s, it's just kind of an whatever cover. Similarly, the second Necromantia album, Scarlet Evil Witching Black, 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10, 100 out of 100. Original cover is amazing, and then the reissue cover Yeah, it's the fucking worst. But for Malice, original cover is just like, so-so. You know, it's good for goofing around with. But then the reissue cover is pretty fucking awesome. Really nailed whatever spooky atmosphere they were going for. I just thought that was kind of interesting. This is the one time they had the reissue cover looks way better than the original. And speaking of a dark occult feeling, this album kind of goes back to that really spooky sound they were working with on their first album. In fact, in many ways, I would almost consider Malice to be a reimagining of concepts from that album, just done in a much more concise and well-written manner. Certainly suitably hellish.
What's it for coming here?
Got some serious hand sanitizer.
And much like Crossing the Fiery Path, this one starts out with a very bombastic, satanic military march. But they're going to do something interesting with it, songwriting-wise. As they transition into faster black metal right here, they're then going to bring back a shade of that motif just for like one measure before reaching a synthesis between the two ideas with this riff, where they keep the same fast drumming style but play a variation on that mid-paced riff from earlier. Definitely intelligent songwriting. And then finally ending on a cool counterpoint version of that initial marching riff. So the songwriting on this album is very precise. I really do see this as a revision of concepts they had on their first album, including those weird spooky interludes, which still exist, but they don't cause the music to lose that sense of momentum in the same way they did in the debut album. They've brought in that new stylistic development from the folky, paganistic EP Ancient Pride and recombined it with their older, darker black metal influences. And speaking of older, darker black metal influences, Total Master's Hammer style riff right there. So yes, if you haven't guessed it by now, my stance on Malice is that it is an amazing and criminally overlooked album. Honestly, my second favorite of their full-length albums, beaten out only marginally by Scarlet Evil Witching Black. But that album already has plenty of good press online, so we're going to keep talking about Malice. An album that is very fond of some rather interesting riff couplings. For instance, we start out with this very fast black metal riff leading into a dark, spooky, gothic black metal waltz in 3/4 time that eventually unfolds into a very cool, more keyboard-heavy section with the piano marking out the progression of the chorus. Very moi de moi in a way. Or perhaps the first and second albums from Psy. And check this out, they're going to do the bit.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
What bit, you ask? Why, it's the classic Iron Maiden Rime of the Ancient Mariner bass break, complete with stereo panning bass lines. I mean, surely metal's not dead enough yet to where people wouldn't recognize that as a reference. Get that old CD out. You see, despite the fact that this is sort of a more evil return to the roots for Necromantia, they've kept all of those old school heavy metal influences they picked up right around the time of Scarlet Evil Witching Black. Not only that, they've even managed to integrate them back into a more evil take on black metal, because if you remember Rime of the Ancient Mariner, they come out of the spooky section all happy. Which is a pretty cool moment for Iron Maiden, but it would not work in a spooky Necromantia black metal song. No, their resolution is a lot darker and more nihilistic. It brings back that cool piano-led melody from earlier, now bolstered with these cool clean bass playing arpeggios. This part gets really dense with the layers because they're going to bring the piano back too. And multiple clean bass lines at the same time in addition to the distorted 8-string bass. Very interesting stuff. Back into that main riff from earlier in the song, much like Rime of the Ancient Mariner did, just a lot darker. And as I mentioned earlier, generally the only time you hear regular electric guitar on a Necromantia album, it's a guitar solo. In this case, all of the guitar solos on this album were supplied by John Fiorentis from Phantom Lord, a pretty underrated power metal band that Magus Vampire Deoloth happened to have signed to his label at the time. So good utilization of connections. But that's not the only cool little weird musical reference / Easter egg that happens on this album. For instance, on the 4th song, Murder, Magic, and Tears, there's a whole lot of that kind of stuff going on, going way further back into music history than just the 80s. Of course, you got your requisite cool, spooky, spacey piano atmospheric parts, with the Magus' regular bass doubling up on the low notes from the piano for maximum atmospheric effect. But after that, we're going on a trip to Russia. With a rousing rendition of the overture to Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. But that's not the only northern country we're going to end up in, because we're also taking a stopover in Norway. With a little bit of the old Edvard Grieg.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
Well, yeah, I know that guy's Swedish, but Jim Henson didn't make no Norwegian chef. Swedish cooking's already terrifying enough. I don't even want to know what the Muppet Norwegian chef is making. Probably fucking Smalahova. Speaking of Scandinavia, I got another cool little weird musical reference / Easter egg that shows up on this album. In this case, it's on the title track, and it's actually to old school Scandinavian black metal history. Nice little Morbid reference there for you. So if you didn't know, Morbid was the band that Dead from Mayhem was in before he was in Mayhem and before he killed himself, and it featured a wacky song at the end of their first demo entitled Disgusting Semla that has this same jokey riff in it. I gotta think that was a reference done on purpose by Necromantia. Shit's really fucking silly. Yeah, you're probably right. It's probably some dumb kid song that I don't know about that both bands are referencing. Whatever.
I'm Mr. White Christmas. I'm high on crack.
But once we get through the possible Morbid reference in the intro to that song, we're hit with a barrage of nasty, tremolo-picked black metal cacophony. And as per usual, this band is a master of the transition riff. Leading into one of my favorite sections of the album, we've had plenty of guitar solos. How about a bass solo? Certainly impressive on a technical level, and I really like how they incorporate these scale runs into the riff itself. Is it going to come around again? I bet it does. And into the spooky, nasty keyboards with the spooky, nasty vocals. Everything about this album is spooky and nasty. But not only that, it's incredibly well written. And that's why I think it's one of the best Necromantia albums. And if you've been a fan of the band for a while and you kind of skipped over this one like most people seem to, you should not have done that. And hopefully I convinced you of that through this episode. But even if I didn't, thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Rock and roll, man!
Yeah, rock and roll!